In the final months of 1945, more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers laid down their weapons to American forces, a scene unthinkable only a year before. These were men raised in a military culture steeped in the creed of Bushido, a warrior code that declared death was preferable to the shame of surrender. They were heirs to centuries of martial tradition, soldiers who had been taught that to live after defeat was to stain their families, their ancestors, and the nation itself. And yet, as the war ground to its bitter conclusion, they emerged from caves, jungles, and shattered garrisons, stepping forward with hands raised, not swords drawn. The image was shocking not just to the Allies, who had braced themselves for endless suicidal resistance, but to the Japanese themselves, who only months earlier had flung their bodies against tanks, ships, and machine guns rather than imagine the disgrace of capture. What had changed? What force could break a code so deeply rooted in blood and spirit that soldiers on Saipan had leapt off cliffs en masse, preferring the ocean's embrace to captivity? Why did tens of thousands of men who had once fought to the last cartridge now hand over rifles without firing a shot? This is not merely the story of military defeat, it is the unraveling of an entire worldview. To understand the enormity of this transformation, one must return to the Pacific in 1945. The Japanese Empire, once triumphant across Asia and the Pacific, was now collapsing on every front. The tide had turned long ago at Midway and Guadalcanal, but by 1945 the situation was more than desperate. Entire islands that had been fortified for years were cut off and left to starve. Garrisons of once proud soldiers resorted to eating roots, rats, even human flesh to survive. In Manila, the capital of the Philippines, Japanese forces had been reduced to rubble and ashes, fighting a hopeless defense against overwhelming American firepower. The Allied command fully expected Japan's defenders to resist to the bitter end, no matter the cost. They had seen it at Tarawa, at Polilliu, at Iwo Jima, battles where Japanese troops fought virtually to extinction, killing thousands of Americans in the process. On Okinawa, civilians had been dragged into the inferno, compelled by propaganda and coercion to commit suicide rather than face occupation. This was the Japan the world had come to know, fanatical, unyielding, fueled by the creed of Gyokusai, honorable death, shattering like a jewel rather than surrendering like a coward. And yet, behind these horrifying spectacles, the truth was shifting. By mid-1945, Japan was no longer capable of sustaining the war it demanded of its soldiers. Its navy lay at the bottom of the sea, its cities were smoking ruins under waves of American firebombs, its skies dominated by fleets of B-29s that rained destruction at will. The home islands were starving, imports strangled by a relentless naval blockade. What had once been a mighty empire was reduced to islands of hungry men, scattered across the Pacific and Asia, disconnected from each other and from Tokyo. Still, American commanders prepared for the worst. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan itself, was expected to cost as many as 1 million American casualties, and several million Japanese lives. War planners braced for a nation that would fight with bamboo spears if necessary, an entire society committed to suicide rather than surrender. The assumption was simple: Japan would never capitulate. But then came Hiroshima. On August 6, 1945, a single bomb erased an entire city, killing tens of thousands in an instant and condemning many more to slow deaths in the ruins. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. For the Japanese military, long accustomed to dying in waves, this was something different. No amount of courage, no number of bayonet charges, no loyalty to Bushido could withstand the blinding light of a man-made sun. Bravery was meaningless against annihilation from the sky. And then, on August 15, the unthinkable happened. For the first time in Japanese history, the voice of the emperor reached his people directly. Emperor Hirohito, regarded by many as divine, spoke words that changed everything. he did not use the word surrender. Instead, he called upon his subjects to endure the unendurable and accept peace to preserve what remained of Japan. For soldiers scattered across the Pacific, starving in jungles, bleeding in trenches, this message was seismic. If the emperor himself commanded them to lay down arms, obedience was no longer shame. Surrender was no longer dishonor. It was an act of loyalty. What followed stunned the world. Across Asia, in Manchuria, in the Philippines, in China, entire Japanese armies, once thought to be unbreakable, laid down their rifles, raised their hands, and marched into captivity. Over 100,000 men surrendered to American forces in a matter of weeks. Some wept as they gave up their weapons. Others bowed their heads in silence, their bodies wasted from hunger and disease. There were officers who chose ritual suicide, unable to reconcile honor with survival, but for the rank and file, the words of the emperor had lifted an impossible burden. Resistance had become meaningless. Survival, once branded as cowardice, had been transformed into obedience. And yet, behind these mass surrenders lies the deeper question: was this truly a choice, or merely the inevitable outcome of an empire crushed by a system of warfare it could not match? Was it the atomic bomb that broke the Japanese spirit, or had years of starvation, exhaustion, and abandonment already eroded the will to fight? The answer lies not in one moment, but in the slow, merciless grind of modern war that left men too weak, too hungry, too shattered to fight on. The paradox remains haunting. A nation that preached death before dishonor became a nation of men surrendering in their tens of thousands. But this was no act of cowardice. It was the recognition of futility, the acceptance that bravery alone cannot defy annihilation. And so, the story begins with a mystery. How did soldiers bound by an unbreakable code find themselves laying down arms without shame? The answer would unfold not in a single instant, but in a long collapse, where courage was stripped away layer by layer, until only survival remained. The myth of the unbreakable Japanese soldier had been forged in blood. On island after island, Americans encountered defenders who fought with a ferocity that seemed beyond reason, men who charged into machine gun fire, who detonated grenades against their own chests rather than accept capture. Yet by the summer of 1945, the illusion of invincibility was disintegrating. The cause was not sudden, nor was it simply fear of atomic fire. It was the slow, methodical crushing of a nation by an enemy that waged war as a machine, relentless, systematic, and inhumanly vast. The American way of war in the Pacific was unlike anything Japan had faced before. It was not brilliance on the battlefield, nor single moments of heroic conquest, but the grinding inevitability of a logistical empire. U.S. shipyards turned out carriers, destroyers, submarines, and landing craft faster than Japan could sink them. Factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh built tanks, trucks, and artillery in numbers beyond comprehension. A single American task force could deliver more firepower in a week than Japan's entire navy could muster in months. Every island, every garrison Japan tried to hold was subjected to the same treatment: isolation, starvation, bombardment, and annihilation. The blockade was merciless. American submarines strangled the sea lanes, severing Japan from the rice of Indochina, the oil of the Dutch East Indies, the steel and rubber of Southeast Asia. Merchant ships went down in flames, their cargoes lost to the deep. Soldiers posted to distant islands soon realized that resupply would never come. Rations dwindled to nothing. Accounts from surviving diaries speak of men eating bark from trees, boiling grass into thin soup, roasting insects over small fires. Some became so desperate that cannibalism emerged in whispers, a final breaking of taboo that revealed the depths of despair. The enemy did not have to kill these soldiers, hunger did the work. The air war compounded the agony. B-29 superfortresses appeared in the skies like harbingers of doom, their engines a low, distant growl that grew into rolling thunder. They unleashed torrents of fire that consumed entire cities. Tokyo, once a proud imperial capital, was transformed into a sea of flames, where tens of thousands suffocated or burned in a single night. Soldiers who heard of these horrors, or saw the ruins with their own eyes, understood that nothing they could do with rifle or bayonet would stop the storm. It was not courage they lacked, but the means to fight a war against steel giants and fire from the sky. As Japan's material strength collapsed, so too did the spirit of its soldiers. They had been told they were the invincible sword of the emperor, but by 1945 they were skeletons wrapped in tattered uniforms, wielding rusting weapons and praying for a miracle. Letters recovered from the front speak of despair, men writing of starvation, of comrades who slipped into death without a bullet fired, of an endless waiting for rescue that never came. Some wrote that they no longer feared death, they feared that their deaths would mean nothing. Then came the shock that seemed to defy even imagination. Hiroshima. A city obliterated not by firebombs or artillery, but by a single bomb that unleashed a power rivaling the sun. The descriptions staggered the military mind, shadows burned into walls, tens of thousands gone in an instant, a silence more terrifying than any battle. Days later, Nagasaki followed. For a warrior class that believed courage could overcome the greatest odds, this was annihilation made absolute. Bravery was no shield against the light that consumed cities in seconds. The machine had revealed its final form, a weapon that made resistance irrelevant. Yet the most decisive blow was not delivered by American steel or fire, but by a voice. On August 15, 1945, for the first time in history, the voice of Emperor Hirohito reached his people directly. Soldiers gathered around radios, straining to hear words obscured by static, their heads bowed in disbelief. He spoke in formal, archaic Japanese, carefully avoiding the word surrender, but his meaning was clear. The war was lost. Japan would accept peace. But he framed it not as defeat, not as dishonor, but as an act of mercy, in order to save the nation from annihilation. To endure the unendurable. To obey. For soldiers who had been taught that the emperor was divine, his command was unshakable. If he demanded their deaths, they would die. If he commanded survival, then even surrender could be redefined as loyalty. The unbearable weight of Bushido was lifted by a single broadcast. Suddenly, the dishonor of survival became a new duty, to live, because the emperor willed it. Across the Pacific and Asia, men who had once sworn never to be taken alive now laid down their arms. They emerged from tunnels and caves, their bodies gaunt, their eyes hollow, carrying weapons they no longer wished to fire. Some wept openly. Others bowed their heads and obeyed. A few officers chose seppuku, unwilling to live with the shame of defeat. But the great tide had turned. Obedience to the emperor was stronger than the code of Bushido itself. The Americans, hardened by years of brutal combat, were stunned. They had prepared for waves of suicidal charges, for endless ambushes, for fanatics who would kill until the last man. Instead, they saw tens of thousands raising their hands in surrender, not with malice, but with resignation. The machine had won. The spirit had yielded. And yet, beneath the silence of surrender, the deeper question remained. Was this the triumph of atomic fire and overwhelming might, or had Japan's soldiers already been broken long before the bombs fell? Had years of starvation, abandonment, and hopelessness made surrender inevitable, with the emperor's voice only giving permission to what was already true in their hearts? The answer lies in the next act of collapse, when the facade of honor finally crumbled, and entire divisions, once thought indestructible, dissolved into captives. The moment had come when the unbreakable soldier broke, not from fear, but from inevitability. The silence that followed the Emperor's broadcast was unlike anything Japan's soldiers had ever known. For years, they had lived with the roar of artillery, the drone of aircraft, the bark of commanding officers demanding impossible sacrifice. Now there was only the emptiness of disbelief. The command was final, the war was over. They were to lay down their arms. The men stared at one another, gaunt faces carved by hunger and disease, rifles clutched loosely in trembling hands. Some broke down in tears. Others stood motionless, as if waiting for someone to tell them it was a mistake. But gradually, one by one, weapons began to drop into the dust. In Manchuria, where the Soviets had launched their thunderous invasion with overwhelming tanks and artillery, Japanese formations simply dissolved. Entire divisions ceased to exist not in glorious last stands, but in orderly surrender. Soldiers who had once trained to resist with bamboo spears now lined up to be marched into captivity. In the Philippines, thousands emerged from jungles where they had fought and starved for years, surrendering in groups so large that American commanders had to scramble to find enough supplies to feed them. In China, scattered units accepted the inevitable, handing over weapons to forces they had once regarded as inferior. The tide was unstoppable. The Japanese army was no longer fighting. It was collapsing into silence. For many Americans, the sight was almost unbelievable. They had come to expect that every Japanese soldier would fight until death, that every engagement would end in bodies piled high at terrible cost. Now they watched as men shuffled forward, hollow-eyed, barefoot, too weak even to stand at attention. Marines and soldiers, conditioned by years of brutal combat, first met these surrenders with suspicion. Was it a trap? Would hidden grenades be detonated as Americans approached? But no explosions came. No sudden ambushes. Instead, the Japanese lowered their heads, extended their rifles butt first, and surrendered without resistance. The emotional weight of these moments was not lost on the soldiers themselves. Diaries speak of men breaking down as they obeyed the command. Some wept uncontrollably, not only for the shame of defeat but for the years of suffering that had led to this final moment. Others clung to one another, relieved to be alive, relieved that the burden of unending struggle was finally over. For them, surrender was not cowardice. It was release. Yet there were those who could not accept it. Officers, in particular, struggled with the contradiction between Bushido and obedience. Many chose ritual suicide, their deaths echoing the ancient codes they could not abandon. In scattered caves and garrisons, small groups refused to believe the war had ended, convinced the broadcasts were lies. These men clung to the old creed, holding out for days, weeks, even years. Some would not surrender until decades later, when the world they imagined still at war had long since vanished. But they were exceptions. The vast majority of Japanese soldiers, once thought fanatical to the last man, laid down their arms in obedience to the emperor. The very voice that had driven them into suicidal charges now commanded them to live. And they obeyed. The American reaction was a mixture of relief and astonishment. For years, war planners had predicted a bloodbath on the beaches of Kyushu and Honshu, where millions of Japanese soldiers and civilians would resist to the death. Instead, the war ended without that apocalyptic struggle. The surrenders that poured in from across Asia and the Pacific spared not only American lives but millions of Japanese who would have perished in a futile defense. The machine of war had prepared for annihilation. Instead, it encountered resignation. The breaking point was not marked by a single dramatic battle, but by a collective collapse of will. It was not a grand finale of charging soldiers, but the quiet handing over of weapons, the lowering of flags, the bowing of heads. It was despair transfigured into obedience. It was the recognition that further resistance would mean nothing. For the Japanese soldier who surrendered in 1945, There was no honor in survival as Bushido once defined it. But there was something else, the emperor's command, which gave legitimacy to their choice. In this way, surrender was reframed not as shame but as duty. It was survival transformed into obedience. And that transformation was decisive. Without it, the war might have continued in waves of blood and fire. With it, more than 100,000 men surrendered in an act as unthinkable as it was inevitable. The image remains haunting. Soldiers who had once fought with unmatched ferocity stood silently, waiting to be marched into captivity. The same men who had been prepared to die in suicidal charges now clutched at the food and water handed to them by their captors. The same soldiers who had sworn to kill until the last breath now bowed in silence before their conquerors. It was a collapse not of bravery, but of meaning. And yet, behind the silence of surrender, a greater truth emerged. This was not the death of courage, but the death of the idea that courage alone could shape destiny in the face of overwhelming power. The individual soldier, no matter how devoted, no matter how willing to die, could not resist the machine of modern war. This was the breaking point, the moment when men realized that courage had become obsolete. And with that realization, they laid down their arms, not in shame, but in acknowledgement of an unavoidable truth. The war was over. The fight was meaningless. All that remained was survival. But what did this surrender mean for the world beyond 1945? What lesson did it teach about the balance between courage and inevitability, between human will and mechanical destruction? The final act would reveal not only the end of Japan's war but the end of an era in which honor could still define the battlefield. The surrender of more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers in 1945 was not simply the end of a war. It was the collapse of an entire worldview. For centuries, Japan's warrior culture had defined courage as the willingness to die. From the samurai's ritual seppuku to the kamikaze pilots who turned their aircraft into weapons, the creed of Bushido declared that honor was greater than life. Yet the end of the Pacific War shattered this ancient code. When Japanese soldiers stepped forward with empty hands, they did more than concede defeat. They revealed a transformation in the very meaning of duty, courage, and survival. At the heart of this transformation was the emperor himself. Hirohito's broadcast did more than order the end of hostilities. It redefined surrender. By calling on his people to endure the unendurable, he gave his soldiers permission to survive, a permission they had never had before. Until then, to lay down arms was to betray ancestors, comrades, and the nation itself. But when the emperor's voice, believed by many to be divine, declared survival necessary, the act of surrender became obedience. What had been shame was now duty. In that subtle shift, the unbearable weight of Bushido crumbled. This reframing prevented an apocalypse. Without the emperor's command, Japan might have bled itself to death in a futile resistance. Operation Downfall, the planned American invasion, would have unleashed destruction on a scale greater than Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. Millions would have died in waves of suicidal resistance. Instead, surrender became a path to preservation. By obeying the emperor, Japanese soldiers not only saved themselves but ensured the survival of their nation. It was not cowardice that stayed their hands, it was a new form of loyalty. But this surrender was also more than obedience to one man. It symbolized the overwhelming power of modern war. The Japanese soldier of 1945 did not lack courage. He had proven his willingness to die in countless battles. What he lacked was the means to resist a system of war that rendered individual bravery meaningless. The American machine, its factories, its fleets, its bombers, and ultimately its atomic fire, was not a foe that could be met with spirit alone. Against such force, the courage of millions became obsolete. This was the true lesson of 1945. that courage, as once understood, had been eclipsed by machinery and industry. In the old world, a warrior's valor could decide a battle. A charge, a duel, a moment of personal sacrifice could shift the fate of armies. But in the modern age, courage was swallowed by the scale of destruction. A bomb could erase a city regardless of how bravely its people faced death. A blockade could starve divisions into surrender no matter their devotion to Bushido. The machine was merciless. And it was unstoppable. The sight of Japanese soldiers surrendering en masse was the visible sign of this truth. It was not their courage that had failed, but the very relevance of courage in a war defined by firepower, starvation, and annihilation. The men who once swore to die rather than submit had discovered that death itself no longer held meaning. To die charging a machine gun nest was one thing, to vanish beneath an atomic sun was another. There was no honor in becoming ash. There was only silence. And so, the meaning of war itself shifted. The surrender of 100,000 Japanese soldiers marked not only the end of the Pacific War, but the beginning of the nuclear age. In this new world, the question was no longer whether men had the courage to fight, but whether humanity could endure weapons that made fighting irrelevant. The Bushido Code, forged in centuries of sword and spear, had been obliterated by technology that reduced warriors to shadows on concrete walls. For Japan, the legacy of surrender was both humiliation and survival. The empire was gone, but the nation endured. Soldiers returned from captivity not as dishonored cowards but as men who had fulfilled the emperor's final command. In this way, Japan was able to rebuild, to rise from the ashes into a new identity. The surrender that once would have been unthinkable became the foundation of a new Japan, one that abandoned conquest for survival, war for peace. But for the world, the lesson was more haunting. The collapse of Bushido showed that even the most deeply rooted codes of honor could be broken by the pressures of modern war. It revealed that human courage, no matter how fierce, could not withstand the scale of industrial slaughter. And it warned of the future, a future in which wars would be decided not by the bravery of soldiers, but by the efficiency of machines and the terror of weapons beyond imagination. The image of those Japanese soldiers, thin and weary, surrendering to an unstoppable enemy, remains more than a historical episode. It is a symbol of a turning point in human history. It reminds us that war had crossed a threshold in 1945. The age of the warrior had ended. The age of the machine had begun. In the end, this was not just Japan's defeat. It was the defeat of an idea, that courage alone could determine the outcome of war. When more than 100,000 men surrendered rather than fight to the last, they showed that survival itself had become the only victory left. Their choice was not shame, but inevitability. And so, the war closed not with the clash of armies, but with silence, the silence of weapons falling to the ground, of soldiers bowing their heads, of a nation accepting the unendurable. In that silence, the old world of honor and death was buried. What rose in its place was a new world, where courage was no longer enough, and where survival itself had become the greatest act of loyalty.